A boot comes down in the ash. Just one. And the print it leaves is fresh, past the eastern wall, through stone that still remembers the heat of 2 years ago. The wind moves a single piece of paper across the flagstones and brings it to rest beside the boot. A grain ledger, 2 years old. The ink still legible. The handwriting belongs to a woman everyone in the Southern Territories agreed was dead. The boot does not move. The man wearing it has gone very still. Closer now. The ruined corridor. The door at the end of it whose frame had buckled in the heat. Whose gap is 12 inches across. There is a handprint pressed into the warped wood, smaller than his, and on the stone beneath it, half buried in ash. A single strand of silver blonde hair. His hand begins to reach for it. She reached for him through the fire. He saw her hand. He turned away anyway. Wait 3 seconds. That was all it took. 3 seconds of pure cowardice, dressed up in a word he liked to call love, and it cost a king his queen, his kingdom. The last clean piece of whatever was left of his soul. Some men lose everything in a war. King Varric lost everything in a choice. And here is the cruel part. The part that would keep him awake for the rest of his life. He made that choice with his eyes open. He knew exactly what he was doing. This is the story of the woman who burned, and did not stay burned. The fire started in the eastern watchtower, at the 3rd bell of night. By the time the first guard screamed, it had already chewed through 2 floors of the barracks. It moved through the stone halls, like a living thing. Something hungry. Something that had been waiting years for this exact night to feed. Smoke poured through the corridors in long black tongues. Then the war drums came. 3 short beats, too long. The signal every wolf in Ironvale knew in their bones. It meant the palace was under assault. Not one breach. Many and every soul who heard those drums understood the same terrible thing. This was no accident. This was a siege. Varric stood in the war room when the drums began. A map of the Southern Territory spread flat beneath his hands. 3 of his generals beside him. And for 4 full heartbeats after the drums started, he did not move. His eyes stayed on the map. His jaw worked slow. Like he was chewing something bitter. Then he straightened. And the man who looked up was not the man who had been studying trade routes 30 seconds before. He was something older. Something with teeth, positions. General Boren was already moving, a broad-shouldered wolf, with a scar splitting his left eyebrow. Eastern walls breached, attackers in black. No crests. Count, 40 inside the outer ring. At least, Varric pulled the iron sword from the rack on the wall. One smooth motion. The hilt worn from years of his grip. The leather darkened and shaped to the exact curve of his palm. He did not have to think about how to hold it. The sword was an extension of his body, the same way lying to himself had become an extension of his mind. Wake every warrior in the 2nd barracks. Seal the armory first. Cut them off at the inner gate. A pause. Where is the la? And there it was. A flicker. Boren's eyes shifted it. Half a second, most men would have missed it. Varric caught it. Throne hall, sire. Evening inventory. Last confirmed position. Varric nodded once. He told himself the twist in his chest was tactical. The Luna was a political figure. Her death in an assault would complicate things with the Eastern Territories. The ones who still respected the old bloodlines. That was the reason his chest was tight. That was a reasonable explanation. He walked out of the war room. He turned left. The throne hall was to the right. His feet took him left without a single moment of conscious thought. Because left led to the private wing. Left led to Celine's chambers. And that was the direction his body had learned to move when the world went wrong. 3 years of sneaking through his own palace in the dark hours. 3 years of teletamsaniamsmafen was temporary, political, manageable, that it had nothing to do with the woman waiting in the royal chambers. The one with the quiet voice, the eyes that saw too much, the habit of setting a cup of warm tea on his desk without being asked. Every single time she sensed he was troubled, he told himself a great many things. He had gotten very good at it. The private wing was already filling with smoke pushed through the door. Selin stood in the center of the room, a dark traveling cloak around her shoulders, a leather satchel already over one arm, her silver blonde hair loose and wild around her face. She was afraid. He could smell it on her. But underneath the fear was something else. Something that did not quite line up. She had already packed. Varric. She crossed the room and gripped his arm with both hands. Thank the old blood you came. I heard the drums. I didn't know if. You're already packed. Her hands tightened. I'm a survivor. I prepare. He should have held on to that. He should have pressed at the loose thread and pulled until the whole thing came apart in his hands. A satchel packed before the first scream. A cloak already on, the exact readiness of someone who had known, but her eyes were wide. Her hands were shaking, and she was right there in front of him, real and warm and present, and the smoke was getting thick, and his brain made the same choice it always made when she was in front of him. He chose the easy thing. Stay close to me. South Passage, she nodded, tucked herself against his side. He did not turn toward the throne hall. He told himself Boren would send someone. He told himself the guards had evacuated her already. He told himself the Luna was not the kind of woman who needed him specifically. She was capable, composed. She had the cold practicality that came from years of being overlooked. She would find her own way out. He told himself all of this in the space of 10 seconds, as his feet carried him in the wrong direction. The screaming started before they reached the South Passage. High, ragged, hitting a frequency that slammed every wolf instinct in his body, upright like a wall of iron. Pack bond recognition. The sound of a wolf who was not just afraid, trapped, cornered. Out of options. His feet stopped without his permission. Selin pulled his arm. Varric the passage. That's her. A beat of silence between them. Fire crackled somewhere above. Plaster dust rained from the ceiling. The guards will get her. Her voice was careful, smooth, the kind of smooth that was built, not born. The guards are fighting 40 wolves in the courtyard. He turned his head toward the screaming. The throne hall. East corridor. Through the vaulted anteroom. 3 minutes at a sprint. He could make 3 minutes. Selin stepped in front of him. If you go back there, we both die. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. And the Luna's screaming tore through the stone and the smoke and found every dark corner of him. And he weighed 2 lives, hands, with the brutal arithmetic that men call pragmatism when they need to sleep at night. He moved forward, his with Selinis. The screaming stopped somewhere, between the junction and the door. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed into his ears like water. He pushed through the heavy iron door into the night air. Smoke, ash, the faraway smell of blood. And he did not stop moving. He did not look back. He told himself the silence meant the guards had reached her. What no one in that courtyard knew was this. Myra had been cataloging the grain records for 40 minutes when the drum started. She set down the wax marker, capped the inkwell, stood. The Luna of Ironvale had developed certain habits over 5 years of living in a palace, where she was tolerated rather than wanted. She moved quietly. She finished tasks before reacting. She did not rush to conclusions before she had information. Those habits had been built through necessity, the same way calluses are built, through repeated friction with the same rough surface. Until the skin finally decides to stop being soft, she went to the throne hall doors, opened the left one 3 inches, looked out. The smoke hit her immediately, not hearth smoke. Something chemical, dense, the kind that comes from burning structure. Pitch and treated timber and old stone, releasing decades of absorbed heat. She heard fighting in the distance. She stepped back, looked at the doors to the east corridor, the west corridor, then up, at the ceiling, where a fresh crack had opened in the vaulted arch over the dais. While she stood listening, east led toward the courtyard, the fighting, west led toward the private wing. The ceiling cracked again. Louder. A ribbon of burning material fell from the gallery. She crossed to the west door, opened it, and found the corridor blocked by a burning crossbeam that had come down from the floor above. The heat was immediate, absolute. She stepped back, pulled the door shut. She stood in the throne hall with her back to the wall, and made a full assessment, the way she had always made assessments, without panic, without wasted motion, with the particular economy of thought that comes from years of solving problems no one else thought were worth solving. East Corridor. Blocked by fighting. West Corridor. Blocked by fire. The ceiling was coming down. She picked up the records box, moved it to the far corner, tucked it into the curve, where a stone support column made a protected angle. She did not know why she did it. There was no rational reason to save grain records in a collapsing building. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the 200 families those records represented. Maybe she just needed something to do with her hands. And then she heard his voice in the corridor. Not the command voice, the other one. The low one, the private one. The voice he used when he thought no one was listening. She recognized it the way she recognized all his sounds. She had spent 5 years learning the vocabulary of his presence. Which footstep meant trouble, which silence meant anger, which set of his shoulders meant he was carrying something he did not know how to put down. She had learned all of it, without being invited to, without telling anyone. Because knowing the terrain of a person who did not particularly want you there was the difference between surviving and not. Varric. The sound tore out of her before she chose to release it. Footsteps in the corridor beyond the east door. Stopping, she moved to the door, hit it with her palm. Varric! The west corridor is blocked. The ceiling is. The first collapse hit. The gallery above the east wall came down in a single enormous impact. The floor shook hard enough to knock her sideways into the door frame. Stone dust erupted from every joint in the walls. The chandelier swung on its chains, iron screaming against iron. She hit the floor on one knee, got her arm up over her face, breathed through her sleeve. When the shaking stopped, she got back to her feet. Varric, louder now. Desperate in a way she had not let herself be in years. The particular cracked open way that only happens when the body understands something the mind has not caught up to yet. She hit the door with her shoulder. It gave partially. The frame had warped. The corridor beyond was blocked, but not completely, and through the gap she could see dim orange light, heavy smoke. 2 shapes in the corridor beyond. She could see him, 10 feet away. His face through the smoke, clear enough to read. The split-second calculation, the moment the math happened behind his eyes, and the answer came out wrong. And he knew it was wrong, and he made the choice anyway. She put both hands against the door and shoved. Varric. He turned away. The shape beside him. Blonde hair, dark cloak, moving fast. And then both shapes were gone around the corner, the corridor empty. The smoke filling it in long rolling waves. The door would not open any further because the frame had buckled and the gap was telltale 12 inches at best. And the second collapse was already beginning in the ceiling above her. She stood at the door, hands braced against the warped frame, and she watched the empty corridor, and she understood with complete and total clarity exactly what had just happened. No rage, not then. Rage was a luxury. She turned from the door, looked at the hall, ran a final assessment, the far left corner, stone support column, oscillate foundation, the grain box, making a low barrier. The angle would deflect some debris if the collapse came from the primary arch. She crossed the hall at a run, got down behind the column, pressed herself into the corner with her arms over her head. She had time for one full thought before the ceiling came down. It was not about him. It was not about rage or grief or the devastating arithmetic of being left. It was clear and cold. And it settled into her like an anchor finding bedrock. If I live through this, she thought, I will never beg for anything again. The second collapse hit. The throne hall died in the 4th hour of the assault. By dawn, when the last attackers were dead or driven into the forest, The surviving warriors began pulling through the debris. They found 3 dead guards near the entrance. They found the royal standard half-burned and curled in on itself. They found a wooden box the Luna had been cataloging. The quarterly grain records for the southern villages, lying open near the far wall. The documents inside somehow mostly intact. They did not find the Luna. The assumption was immediate. The hall had been an inferno. The ceiling had collapsed twice. No wolf without combat. Training and knowledge of the hall's structure would have survived the first fall, let alone the second. And the Luna was known as many things. Survivalist was not one of them. She was known as quiet, known as careful. The Luna, who organized the winter relief shipments herself, who remembered the names of every child in the lower village, who could silence a room not with authority, but with a particular stillness. The stillness of a person who had learned very young to take up as little space as possible. None of those qualities would save you from 4 feet of stone. By mid-morning, Thornton brought the news to the courtyard, where the king stood watching the recovery teams. Nobody recovered. Given the state of the hall, a pause. She's gone. Varric said nothing for a moment. Say it properly. His voice was flat, controlled. The way things are controlled when they are being held down by main force. Boren took a breath. Luna, Myra is presumed dead in the collapse of the throne hall. Varric turned away from the rubble. Begin preparation for an official announcement. I want the territory lords notified before the news reaches the common quarter. He walked back toward the surviving wing. Celisin was waiting at the corridor entrance. She had changed into clean clothes, pinned her hair, composed her face into something that approximated grief. The right amount of sorrow. The right degree of restraint, calibrated perfectly for public viewing. She reached for his hand when he passed. He let her take it, and he kept walking. The dark was total, and it had weight. Myra became aware of it slowly, in stages. The way you come back after a violent shock, first the pressure, then the separation of that pressure into distinct sources, then the slow, painful inventory of each injury against one question: could she move? Left arm, pinned, not broken. The stone across her forearm was heavy, but it had wedged against the column instead of crushing. She could feel her fingers. She focused on that. Fingers meant the bone was whole, right side. 3 cracked ribs, at minimum. Breathing was possible, expensive. Each full breath cost something she was not sure she had. Head, cut above the left ear. The blood had dried, which meant she had been out long enough for blood to dry, which meant time had passed, which meant the assault was over. Which meant no one was looking for survivors in the throne hall, because no one expected survivors in the throne hall. The air was hot and dry and thick with dust. She breathed shallow. She worked the trapped arm free over what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. And when both arms were hers again, she began the slow, brutal work of moving stone. She did not think about him. She thought about load distribution. She thought about the corner she had chosen. The column was still vertical, still bearing weight, which meant the debris above had formed a profile vault, not a solid fill. She thought about inches. She thought about the fact that somewhere above her was air, and she would either reach it or she would not. She worked. Her nails broke on the stone. Her ribs screamed every time she shifted a large fragment. Twice she pressed her forehead to the cold floor and breathed through the pain until it flattened into something she could carry. And then she started again. She did not call for help. There was no point. She had learned that lesson. Efficiently, completely. In the last thing she had seen before the ceiling fell, the air changed before she broke through. A subtle shift in the drift of the dust. A degree of cooling that made no sense unless there was circulation above. She altered the angle of her work. Found the gap 40 minutes later, a fist-sized opening between 2 fragments. Gray pre-dawn light slanting through. She worked it larger. She was halfway through when the hand came. Not from above, from the side. through a separate gap she had not found. From outside the rubble field entirely, a hand that came through the dark with absolute certainty, as if whoever owned it had known exactly where she was before they reached. The hand was large, the grip immediate. It caught her wrist, not her sleeve, not her forearm, her wrist. With the precision of someone locating a pulse point, she went completely still. "Don't fight it." The voice was low, rough-hewn, not an Ironvale accent, something from further north, where the winters last 10 months and the language has been carved down to its bones by people who could not afford unnecessary words. "I need to see your face before I trust you." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. A pause. Then the debris shifted from the outside. Large fragments moved with a force that should have taken a team of men. Moved by one pair of hands, and the gap widened, and the gray dawn came in. And the man on the other side resolved into view. He was enormous. Not the thick-necked mass of a palace warrior bred to intimidate. Something leaner, more permanent. The kind of presence that comes from decades of actual use rather than performance. Black cloak, dark hair. Jaw set hard as the stone between them. Eyes a strange pale gray-green in the dawn. The color of ice over deep water. No crest, no livery, no marks. His face told her nothing, except that he had survived significant violence in his life, and been neither destroyed nor softened by it. "Who are you?" He did not answer right away. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. Past the question of whether. Into the logistics of how. Can you pull yourself through with one arm? "I asked you a question, and I'll answer it when you're not bleeding into a collapsed ceiling." He held her gaze. The grip on her wrist had not changed. Same pressure, same certainty. "Can you pull through? Or do I widen the gap?" She evaluated him for 3 seconds. "I can pull through." She did. It cost her more than she let him see. And when she cleared the rubble and came out into the cold, ash-gray morning, her legs gave way, and she went down hard on one knee in the debris. She put a hand to the ground, held herself up, breathed, and did not let herself fold any further. Because she had made a decision in the dark under that ceiling, and she intended to keep it. The man crouched in front of her, not touching, just level with her, reading her the way someone reads terrain. 3 broken ribs. Maybe 4, the arms bruised to the bone. Intact, it was not a question. He was reading it from her posture and her breathing. The way a tracker reads ground. "Who are you?" Not desperation now, something else. A need for accurate information before she made her next decision. He looked at her a moment, drawl. "They call me the Dark Alpha in the territories north of the line. I assume that means nothing to you." It meant something. The name had come through Ironvale's intelligence networks twice in the last 3 years. Both times attached to reports the generals had dismissed as exaggerated. A wolf who ruled the northern Forbidden Lands, who had never once bent knee to any ruling alpha, who was said to move through fire and violence the same way other men move through markets, without difficulty, without leaving traces. She had read those reports herself. While cataloging the filing system the generals could not be bothered to organize, and she remembered thinking, as she read their dismissals, that the most dangerous trait in an enemy is the one you convince yourself isn't real. "You came here for a reason." "Yes, tell me the reason." He held her gaze. The dawn was breaking now. Behind her, the ruins of the throne hall sat in the early light, smoke still curling from the deepest debris. The collapsed walls showing their insides to the sky, like something cracked open and hollowed. "I came to Ironvale to deliver a warning to your king. Word reached the north 3 weeks ago. A specific attack was planned for this night. I arrived 6 hours before it started, a beat. I was denied entrance at the gate." The simplicity of that sentence did something terrible to her ribs, or maybe that was just breathing. "You were denied entrance. I was told the king was occupied. The palace was not receiving unaffiliated wolves." A pause. "By the time I convinced the outer gate to send a message up, The drums had already started. She absorbed that. She held it flat in her hands and her mind and looked at it from every angle, and let herself understand the full shape of it. The warning had come. The door had been closed. You pulled me out of the rubble. Yes. Why? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was the first thing anyone had given her in 5 years that she had not had to earn or negotiate or apologize for needing, because you were alive. And you survived something that should have killed you twice over. And in my experience, things that survive what should have killed them are worth understanding. She looked at him in the gray morning light, in the ruins of the kingdom that had left her to burn. Her ribs hurt, her arm hurt. The dried blood above her ear pulled at her skin when she moved her jaw. She thought about the intersection, the smoke, his face in the gap of the door, the calculation behind his eyes, and the choice that followed it. She thought about 5 years of making herself small enough to fit a space that was never built for her. She thought about the grain box in the corner of the rubble. She could see it. From here, the corner of it visible under a thin layer of stone dust. Still intact. 300 families. 2 months until the winter distribution. And she thought about what she had decided in the dark. I need to know something, ask it. The Northern Territories. The Forbidden Lands. Is there room there for someone who has nothing left here? Drawl looked at her for a long moment. His pale eyes moved over her face. Not with the measuring quality of a man evaluating a woman. With the quality of someone evaluating the accuracy of a stated fact. You have something left here. You just named it yourself. She did not understand. 300 families. The winter distribution. Something moved in her chest. She did not have a name for it. That's not. I'll send 3 of my people to handle it. Anonymously. It will be done. She stopped. She looked at him. Why would you do that? Because you were going to ask me for it, and it's a reasonable ask. And whoever's left in that palace right now is not going to prioritize a grain list. He paused. And because if you're coming north, I'd rather you come without a debt you can't discharge. The logic was so clean it almost hurt. She pushed herself to her feet. It cost her everything she had. And she did it without asking for help, and without letting herself fold. And when she was standing fully. She looked at the ruins of the palace. She had given 5 years of her life, too, and she looked at it without flinching. Then she turned north. Walk with me. And tell me what you know about the lands past the line. He stood. He fell into step beside her. Neither of them looked back. They were 40 feet from the rubble when the surviving palace gates began to open. The first patrol came out into the dawn, and Myra pulled the hood of the borrowed cloak up over her head, and they walked through the long morning shadows at the edge of the outer wall. And no one saw them, and no one that called out then. The gates closed up again, behind the patrol, and the morning went on without her in it. The Luna of Ironvale was dead. Everyone would believe it by midday. She walked north with a stranger through the ash and the early cold. Cracked ribs, dried blood above her ear, nothing on her back but a borrowed cloak. And for the first time in 5 years she breathed without the tightness that came from occupying a space she was never welcomed into. It felt like stepping out of a room she had not realized was suffocating her. Behind her, somewhere in the surviving wing, a king was already telling himself he had no choice. She did not know that. She did not need to. She already understood everything she needed to understand about the choices Varric made. When his back was to the fire. There's a ridge camp 2 miles northeast. My wolves are there. We rest your ribs a day. Then we move. I don't need a day. Your ribs need a day. I'll manage. He glanced at her. Was something in the look, not amusement exactly. The closest cousin to it. You'll manage yourself into a punctured lung if a fracture shifts wrong on a 2-day march. Then we move carefully. A pause. She considered it. One night. Pause. Voids. Hot. One night they walked. The dawn spread in long cold bands of light. Gray first, then pale amber. Then the first real gold breaking over the eastern hills. The ruins of Ironvale sat behind them in the new light, smoke rising thin and straight in the windless morning. The great eastern wall, standing intact and meaningless, around a kingdom that had burned itself open from the inside. Somewhere ahead, past the line and the forbidden territories, and the long northern winter, already sharpening its teeth, there was a question for her she had not asked yet. She would ask it, not today. Today was for putting miles between herself and the woman she had been, but the question was coming. And it was this: what does a wolf become when everything that was used to define her is gone? The answer was already forming. In her blood, in her bones, in the cracked open place in her chest, where something old and accommodating was beginning to die. She was going to find out. The ridge camp was 3 canvas tents, and a fire built low, the kind that gives heat without giving light. A distinction that told her something about the man who had ordered it made. Drawl's wolves were 6 in total. They looked at her the way soldiers look at an unknown variable. Not hostile, not welcoming. Just reading, she read them back. They were not palace wolves. Palace wolves had a performance layer. The constant low-grade awareness of being watched by superiors and subordinates at once. It made them stand a certain way, hold their faces a certain way, even when they thought no one was looking. These 6 had none of that. They stood like the terrain stood, like they had grown out of the ground here, and could wait as long as the ground could wait. One of them spoke first, a woman, compact, sharp-featured, a short blade at each hip. The particular stillness of someone who had already assessed every exit in the camp. Before Myra finished walking in, she's hurt worse than she's showing. I know. How bad? Ribs. 3 or 4. The woman looked at Myra directly, the kind of direct that did not ask permission. Can you ride? Yes, she'll manage. And the faint edge in Drawl's voice was not correction. It was confirmation. The woman heard the difference. She nodded once and moved back toward the supply line without utter another word. Myra filed it away, the way he had said it. Not defending her, not performing reassurance, just stating what he had assessed as fact, and moving forward. She had never once in 5 years heard someone state a fact about her capability without either softening it to condescension or hardening it to dismissal. The neutrality was almost disorienting. The woman's name was Kessa. Myra would learn that later. She would learn, too, that Kessa had been driven from her home territory 3 years ago after refusing a mate bond assignment from her alpha. That in certain southern territories, such an arrangement was still enforceable under pack law, that Kessa had killed the assigned male before she left, and had been walking north when Drawl's people found her, and you stayed, and Kessa would shrug. He doesn't ask for things I'm not willing to give, a glance sideways. First time that was true of anyone, and Myra would understand that. In a way that lived in the bones rather than the head, but that was later. For now she lowered herself onto a flat stone near the fire, worked on breathing shallow and even, and not letting the pain in her side show on her face. Drawl sat across from her. He did not offer help. He did not watch her with the quality of a man waiting to be needed. He simply occupied the space, with the settled solidity of someone who had learned that presence was more useful than performance. The settlement. How many people? He was quiet a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer. The quiet of someone deciding precisely how much of the answer was necessary right now. 460. 63 of them children. Mostly wolves who left the southern territories by choice. Some who were driven out. A few who wandered north because they had nowhere else to go. She breathed through the weight of that. 460. Not a camp. Not an outpost. A community. In territory the southern kingdoms had collectively agreed did not exist. What do you need? That you don't have. He was quiet for a count of 3. A system. I can hold territory. I can protect people. I can make decisions under pressure and train wolves to fight and negotiate from strength with anyone who tests the border. A pause. What I cannot do is build the thing that turns a group of people surviving together into something that lasts beyond my lifetime. Supply chains, fair allocation, the 100 small systems that hold a community from the inside. She heard what he was not saying. He was describing what she did, what she had been doing for 5 years, in someone else's kingdom, without title or credit. The invisible architecture that kept a palace running while Uffles concerned themselves with borders and battles and the performance of power. You knew that about me. Before tonight, I knew of your work, the intelligence reports. You're thorough, it shows in outcomes. He held her gaze. A kingdom doesn't run on muscle. It never has. It runs on the people who remember that grain distribution affects troop morale, and troop morale affects border security, and border security affects the tax base. The people who see the whole loop. A pause. I know. Because your king's kingdom ran significantly above what his council's competence should have produced. The fire shifted. She kept her face even. And tonight I came with a warning and arrived too late to give it. What happened after is what happened. I pulled you out because you were alive. Everything after that is your choice. She looked at the fire for a long moment. That night she slept in the third tent, on a bedroll plain and adequate. She woke twice in the dark, once from pain, once from a dream that dissolved before she could name it. And both times she lay in the dark and ran forward calculations instead of backward ones. What she had, what she would need, what the settlement required, what she was capable of delivering. On the new terms she had set for herself in the rubble, the terms were simple. She would not make herself small again. Not for comfort, not for safety, not for the exhausting labor of managing other people's discomfort with her competence. Whatever she built in the north, she would build it standing at full height. She slept. The march took 4 days. Her ribs complained every mile. She gave them the minimum necessary attention and spent the rest of her bandwidth reading Drawl's wolves, learning the dynamics, understanding which ones followed him from loyalty, which from practical assessment, and which from the particular kind of belonging that happens when you have been nowhere, and someone gives you somewhere. The settlement appeared on the 4th afternoon. They crested a long ridge. The valley below opened up, and it was not at all what she had prepared herself for. She had built a mental image from the words camp and survival. Something sparse, defensive, provisional. What she saw was a town. Not a large one, not a wealthy one, but a real one. Permanent structures with actual roof lines, a central thoroughfare, organized agricultural plots on the south-facing slopes, a water system fed by mountain runoff through cut channels, smoke from cook fires in the early evening, thin, domestic children, visible even from the ridge. She stood at the top of the ridge and looked at it for a long moment. You built this in 8 years? We built it. That's the part I need you to understand before we go down. There is no I in what's below us. Every structure, every system, every decision about where to put the water channels. That was 400 people solving problems together. My part was holding the space long enough for them to do it. She looked at him. That's not nothing, no. But it's also not sufficient. They need what comes next, and I am not the one who knows how to build it. She looked back at the valley, 460 people, 63 children, 3 years of self-sufficiency that would need to become 5, 10, 20. Something was happening in her chest. Not grief. Not the cold aftermath of betrayal. Something harder, cleaner. Directional, the same feeling she had had in the dark, under the rubble. When she had calculated the angle of the debris and started moving stone, not hope, exactly, more like the moment when a problem resolves from impossible to merely difficult. She looked down at the valley that the maps called empty. And for the first time, long time, in a very long time, she was not waiting to be chosen. She was choosing. Walk with me. And she went down into it. She went down into the valley, and the valley took her. Not in the way a kingdom takes a queen. There was no ceremony, no crown, no one bowed. The first person she met was a boy of maybe 9, carrying a bucket of water from the cut channel, who looked at her cracked ribs and her dried blood and her borrowed cloak and said only, "You're the one Drawl went south for." "I'm one of them," the boy nodded. Like that settled something, and he walked on. And she thought, watching him go, that this was a place where you were measured by what you carried, not by who had chosen you. She liked that. She liked it more than she had liked anything in 5 years. The next 18 months were the most consuming of her life, and also the most inhabited. She did not have a better word for it. Inhabited. The sense of fully occupying the space she was in. Rather than apologizing for taking it up, she started with the records, because that was where she always started. Because numbers do not lie the way people do. Because a kingdom's truth lives in its grain stores, its water rights, and the quiet arithmetic of who eats and who does not. And what she found was a mess, a functional mess, but a mess. The allocation system distributed resources by household, which meant single adults came up short and large families came up long. And the long families quietly traded the surplus in a barter economy that was efficient and invisible and impossible to plan around. She did not eliminate the barter. She mapped it. She made it visible. She formalized the channels rather than killing them, which was not the move Orin had expected her to make. Orin was a large, weathered wolf, somewhere in his 50s, hands that had done real agricultural work for decades. The administrative instincts of a man who had been improvising for years, and carrying the whole picture alone in his head. He was territorial about the records. She was direct about it. You built something functional out of nothing. That's not a small thing. I'm not here to replace it. I'm here to scale it past the point where one man's memory can hold the whole picture. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had been told his work was valued and was waiting for the other half of the sentence. The part that always came. The but. The catch. The way the praise turns into a leash. There was no other half. He waited. It did not come, and something in his shoulders kicked down half an inch. Like a man setting down a pack he had carried so long he had forgotten. It was heavy. Over 3 weeks, he started bringing her the problems he had been carrying alone. And the settlement began to change. She did not examine what was growing between her and Drawl. She told herself she was too busy, which was true. And she was also, if she was honest, not ready. The rubble had left something in her that needed time to set before she put weight on it. A structural caution, not fear. Adjacent to it, the instinct of someone who had experienced failure at a load-bearing point and was not going to rush the next assessment. So she worked. They met twice a week, her and Drawl, the intersection points, where allocation affected patrol capacity, where patrol patterns affected agricultural access, where the gap between what the settlement needed and what it could defend created pressure. The meetings were direct, sometimes contentious, always productive. He pushed back on her proposals when he disagreed, specifically, with reasons, not with the blunt force of authority. She pushed back on his security decisions when they had resource implications he had not accounted for. Neither of them won every argument. Both of them made better decisions because of the arguments they lost. She had not known that was possible in a governing context. She had spent 5 years in a court where disagreement was either dangerous or pointless, where being right was a liability, where the smart would to plant the idea and let the alpha think he thought of it. Here, she just said the thing, and he heard it, and sometimes he said no, and the no meant no. No, because I'm in charge. No, because here is the flaw in your reasoning. It was, she thought, the most respectful thing a person had done for her in a very long time. To simply tell her the truth. The settlement grew. Word moved through the northern lands the way word always moves in places without official channels. Through traders, through travelers. Through the accounts of people who had passed through a valley in the mountains and seen something they had not expected to see. A community with functioning infrastructure and no master demanding tribute. A dark alpha who held the land without claiming ownership of the people on it. A woman who had appeared from nowhere and built the kind of systems that other territories paid councils of lords to produce. And produced them without political theater. More wolves came north. By the end of the first year, the population had grown to 640. By the end of the second, it was approaching 900. And somewhere in those 900 was the first real test. It came on a cold morning in the second autumn, a delegation from the lower quarter, 12 wolves, led by a man named Hale who had come north 8 months before, hard-eyed, suspicious by nature. The kind of suspicion that had probably kept him alive in the south and had nowhere useful to go now that he was safe. He stood in the central thoroughfare. And he said the thing out loud that some of them had been whispering. Who is she? Really, because here is what fear does to a community. Fear looks for a shape, and Myra was a shape it could use. A southern woman, appeared from nowhere, knew the old kingdom systems too well, restructured everything in 18 months. Talked to the Dark Alpha as an equal. What if she was a plant? What if Ironvale had sent her north to learn the settlement from the inside, to map it, to hand it back? It is a stupid theory, except fear is not stupid. Fear is efficient. Fear finds one's explanation lets the frightened man feel like he saw it coming. And the thing about a rumor in a small place is that it does not need to be true, it only needs to be unanswered. Drawl wanted to handle it the direct way, which, for Drawl, meant standing in front of Hale and letting the man feel the full weight of what it would mean to keep going. Myra stopped him. No, he's poisoning the well. He's afraid. And you can't make a frightened less afraid by frightening him more. So what? So I show them the well is clean. She did not give a speech. She did something stranger. She opened the records. All of them. The full allocation system, the barter map, the supply chains, the census. Every number she had touched in 18 months, she put it in the learning hall. And she said anyone who wanted to understand exactly how the settlement worked could come and read it. And she sat there for 3 days. And she answered questions. Because here is the thing about a system built on secrets. It cannot survive being seen. And here is the thing about a system built on fairness. It only gets stronger. He'll come on the second day. He did not apologize. Hard men rarely do. But he sat down across from her with his arms crossed. And he asked her to explain why his household, a single adult, got the allocation it got. And she explained it, number by number. And at the end he was quiet for a long moment in the south. They took my mate's death allotment and called it a tax. I know. That's why the system here separates death benefits from the general fund. So no one can do that again. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. You built that on purpose. I built everything on purpose. He stood up and he did not say thank you. But he went back to the lower quarter and the whispering stopped. Not because she had crushed it, because she had outshone it, and Drawl, watching from the doorway, said nothing. But that night, at the meeting, he set a cup of something warm in front of her before she sat down. She looked at it. She did not say anything. But she noticed everything. The second test was not a rumor. It was 40 mercenaries on the southern approach. They came at dawn on a gray morning in early winter. Hired wolves, no crest, probing the border. The kind of force someone sends to find out if a place is soft. It was not Drawl's defense was a thing of brutal economy. He did not meet them at the wall. He let the terrain do half the work. The valley had one good approach, and he had spent 8 years understanding exactly how to make that approach expensive. Kessa took the eastern flank with a dozen wolves. Drawl took the center. It was over in an hour. The mercenaries left 19 of their 40 on the slope and broke for the south. And Myra watched from the administrative center, spear. And she understood something while she watched. This was a message. 40 mercenaries do not probe a border for free. Someone had paid them. Someone had wanted to know how soft the northern settlement was, and someone was about to be disappointed. Who sent them? Don't know yet. Find out. I'm working on it. Work faster. Because 40 mercenaries is not an attack, it's a question. And whoever asked it is going to ask a bigger one. She was right. She was always right about this kind of thing. She just did not yet know how right. South of the line, in a war room she had walked through 100 times, a king was coming apart slowly. Varric was always in the war room now, in the particular way of a man who needed the geometry of strategy to hold himself together. Maps, supply lines, border disputes, problems with edges, problems that responded to direct force. Because the other kind of problem, the kind with no edges, the kind that lived under his sternum, like water pressure behind a cracking dam, that kind did not respond to anything. He saw it every time he closed his eyes. The intersection, the smoke, the sound of her screaming his name, and then his feet carrying him away, and the silence that followed. He had built his survival on the lie that the silence meant the guards had reached her. The lie was working less well now, and Celine was always there, composed, patient, wearing the secondary consort's sigil he had never formally granted and somehow never formally revoked, which said something about how things had gone. She managed him. He knew it. He let it happen. Because being managed was easier than being alone with the thing under his sternum. The report reached Boren's desk on a Tuesday, and sat there unopened for 3 days. When Boren finally opened it, he read it twice. Then he went to find the king. He put the report on the map table. Northern Border Patrol. 3 weeks ago, Varric read it without picking it up. His face did not change. He had gotten very good at that. A patrol. Standard route. Had encountered an unusual convoy moving north on the old track. A track considered impassable for 15 years. The convoy moving fast. Organized. When the patrol called for identification, it had not stopped. They tracked it 2 miles before the terrain cut them off. And the detail at the bottom, the one Boren watched for X's find. And stay on, the convoy had been escorted by wolves in black armor, bearing a crest none of the patrol recognized. One of them had sketched it from memory, a crown, over a field of ash rising from it, and rising out of the ash, rendered in the rough strokes of a tired soldier, the image of a wolf, standing, unbroken, facing north. Varric stared at it for a long time. Burn this. Boren did not move, sir, I said. Burn it or don't burn it. But understand before you decide. This is the 3rd such report in 6 months. The first 2 I handled without bringing them to you. I'm bringing you this one because the convoy moved in organized formation. At least 30 wolves. And 30 wolves in formation under an unrecognized crest is no longer something I can manage quietly. Varric looked up from the report. Boren met his gaze, held it. Did not flinch. Where's the origin? Unknown. They were already moving when the patrol found them. Direction, north. Into the forbidden territories. Varric put his hands flat on the map. The same hands. The same choice. The smoke. He looked down at the sketch. Crown, ash. Wolf standing. Start a quiet inquiry. No official channels, independent sources only. What kind of information? He tapped the sketch once. Who that belongs to. And what they're building. Boren picked up the report. He paused at the door. And if the inquiry finds something that changes what we believe about the night the throne hall burned, he said it carefully. What then? Varric did not answer. Boren left, and the king stood alone in the war room with the cold morning light coming through the high windows. Something was shaking, crown. Ash. Wolf standing, reaching through the fire. He pressed his knuckles into the table until the bones ached. The lie had just developed a crack. Here is what Varric did not know. The first 2 reports had not been handled by Boren alone. Celine had seen them too, because Celine saw everything that moved through that court. She had spent 6 years learning to work through other people, to leave no fingerprints on outcomes she engineered, and a border report was kind of the thing a patient woman intercepts on its way up chain. She had read the first report 8 months ago, and she had known, not suspected. Known because Celine had been the one who opened the eastern gate that night. Celine had been the one who let the attackers in. Celine had packed her satchel before the first scream because Celine had known the exact hour the fire would start. The whole thing had been hers. The siege was cover. The fire was the weapon, and the target had never been the kingdom. The target had been the Luna, the quiet woman who saw too much, who organized records too well, who had, 3 weeks before the fire, found an accounting discrepancy in the royal treasury and asked one quiet question too many. Celine had been bleeding that treasury for years, funding things, building things, cultivating relationships in territories Varric did not know she had ever visited, and the Luna had nearly seen it, so the Luna had to burn, and she had. Or so Celine believed, for 2 years. Until a border patrol sketched a crown rising out of ash, and Celine looked at that sketch and recognized, in the rough strokes of a tired soldier, the unmistakable signature of a problem she thought she had already solved. The dead do not build empires, which meant the Luna was not dead, which meant the one person alive, who might be able to prove what Celine had done that night, was now sitting throne of her own, 900 wolves at her back. Celine did not panic. Panic was for amateurs. She began, very quietly, to make arrangements. Back in the north, Myra felt the air change. She could not have said how, but she had spent her whole life reading the weather of other people's intentions, and the weather had shifted. The mercenary probe, the convoy sighting. She knew the border patrols had reported the fact that no second probe had come, which was, in its way, more alarming than a second probe would have been, because it meant whoever was testing them had gotten the information they wanted, and had stopped testing, and moved on to planning. They know we're here. Whoever it is, yes, and they know we're not soft. Yes, which means the next move won't be force. Force is expensive, and we made it more expensive than it's worth. So they'll come at our legitimacy instead. We have no formal recognition from any southern territory. As long as that's true, every wolf here who left a southern kingdom has unresolved legal status under pack law. 60 of them, maybe 70. People who left under coercion, whose former territories could try to claim them back. The room was quiet. If someone files reclamation claims on our people, we're defending on multiple fronts, with informal status, and no standing to push back. Kessa, by the door. How long would that take to do? A week, maybe less. For someone with the right connections in the Southern councils, she looked at the spring projections in her hand. 900 people. The first genuinely surplus year. Enough food not just for the settlement but for trade, for reserve, for the kind of buffer that turns a community from vulnerable to stable. She had known this was coming. You do not build something this large in territory the kingdoms called empty, without eventually catching their attention. The question had never been whether, only when, and the when. She understood now, was very close. The convoy sighting generated exactly the inquiry she had predicted. A scout came back from the southern ridge, with word that a border patrol had made a second pass on the old track. Slow this time, deliberate, not patrolling, surveying, description, standard patrol. 4 wolves. One had a tracking specialist's kit, so the inquiry had teeth now. He'll send someone north. Not immediately. He'll want information first. But eventually he'll send someone. And when that someone reports back, the question becomes whether what's been built here looks like a threat or an opportunity. What's your read? She was quite a moment. Varric thinks in terms of what he can absorb. The name moved through the room with the weight of something that had not been said out loud for a long time. Kessa's expression did not change. Oren looked at the window. He'll try to claim it. He won't get the access. Flat. Final, not through force. Which means negotiation. Which means he sends someone with terms. And that someone, if they're smart, will have specific instructions about what to offer the woman who built it. The room went very quiet. You think he knows you're alive. Not yet. But the convoy sighting will generate a description. And then, she stopped. She thought about the intersections, the smoke. His face through the gap in the warped door. She thought about the woman who had stood at that door and understood completely what was happening, and turned around anyway, and decided to survive. That woman was gone. The woman standing in this room with spring projections in her hand and 900 lives as her working material. She was built from the same bones, but she was not the same architecture. He would find out she was alive, and when he did, he would come, not out of love, or not only out of love, because whatever Farakak felt for her had always been real enough to wound her with. Just never quite real enough to matter when it counted. He would come because 900 wolves in functional territory was exactly the kind of source a weakened kingdom needed. She picked up the projections, double the southern perimeter watches, not aggressive posture. Information gathering. I want to know, the moment a patrol makes a third pass on that track. She looked at Orin. Accelerate the trade certification with the 3 closest outer settlements. I want formal documentation of our exchange relationships before any outside party arrives to characterize what we're doing here. Orin was already moving. Kessa had that look. The one that meant she was recalibrating something. You're not running, no. You're not hiding either. We were never hiding. We were building. She set the projections down with the precise economy of a woman who had spent 2 years having exactly the amount of time each task required. And not one moment more. Now we make sure what we've built is documented, formalized, and legally non-trivial to challenge. When they come, and they will come, they'll arrive expecting to find the Luna of Ironvale. She looked at the map. Not blank space. Not forbidden. Nothing. 900 people. 91 children. The first surplus. They will not find her. The horn sounded from the southern ridge 8 days later. Myra was in the administrative center reviewing the spring projections when she heard it. 2. Short notes, 1 long. Movement on the old track. But not a patrol this time. The pattern was wrong. This was a single rider. A messenger. She set down the projections. She felt the room shift around her. Kessa's hand moving slightly toward her hip blade. Orin's stillness taking on a particular quality. Drawl by the far wall. Going very still in the way that was not passivity but the absolute focused attention of a man holding back a response in order to think before he acted. A messenger. Alone. A king's envoy travels with escort. Minimum 4. Usually 8, I know, because the size of your escort was a language. Everyone in the Southern Territory spoke fluently, and a single rider on the old track meant one of 2 things. Either the message was too sensitive for witnesses, or the sender did not want anyone knowing it had been sent. Both possibilities told her something. The clock had not started. It had already run out. Bring the messenger up the southern road. But hold him at the eastern hall. Not here. I don't want him seeing the records layout. Drawl was already moving toward the door. She took 3 breaths. She used them to close the projections, straighten the map on the wall to its exact position, and settle her face into the particular neutral she had spent 2 years perfecting. Not cold, not welcoming, just a surface that gave nothing away, while taking everything in. The Luna of Ironvale had gone soft at the edges when a room needed her to, had become whatever was required. The woman who would walk to that hall walked at her own pace and stopped where she chose to stop, and did not adjust her posture for anyone waiting. The messenger was young. Mid-20s, maybe. Ironvale livery under a traveling cloak. He kept the cloak on when she walked into the eastern hall, which meant either the cold had gotten to him on the trail, or he was uncertain enough about his reception that he wanted his options covered. His eyes did the thing she had been watching men's eyes do for 2 years now. The recalibration, the adjustment of prior assumptions. The specific quality of being caught off guard by what you found when you expected something diminished. She let him recalibrate. She did not help him. You carry a message. From King Varric, he reached into his cloak, produced a sealed document, the Ironvale royal crest. Wolf's head, crown above, same as it had always been. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it, broke the seal without ceremony. Read. The letter was 2 pages in Varric's handwriting. She recognized it immediately. The forward-leaning slant of a man who wrote fast and thought faster. The places where the ink pressed harder, under, words he was giving extra weight. She read it through, once without expression. Then she folded it. Wait here. She left the hall without looking back. She found Drawl in the corridor outside. He read her face. She had gotten better at controlling it. He had gotten better at reading it. At this point, the two skills were approximately matched. Tell me. She handed him the letter. He read it. His jaw tightened once on the second page. When he finished, he folded it the same way she had, held it in one hand. Looked at her. He knows. He knows. The letter did not say it directly. Varric had never been a direct writer. He thought in implications, in the spaces around what was stated. And he expected the reader to do the work of assembly. But the contents made no sense as a message to an unknown northern leader, and complete sense as a message to a specific woman he had believed dead for 2 years. He was proposing an alliance. Northern territories recognized as sovereign. Trade access through the old corridor, Ironvale, military support against any southern challenges to the settlement's legitimacy, terms that were genuinely valuable. Terms that were also, she understood immediately, structured around what he knew she needed. Rather than what any anonymous northern leader would require, he knew her operational priorities. Of course he did. She had built them. He's not sending this through official channels. Which means his court doesn't know. Which means Celine doesn't know. He paused. Something moved behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly. Something more careful. Or she does know. And the unofficial channel is the point. She took the letter back. Send the messenger back with a conditional response. We acknowledge receipt. We request a secondary contact at the northern border before any formal negotiation. 2 weeks, you're giving him a rope. To see if he hangs someone with it, I'm giving him 2 weeks to handle this himself. Or fail to. If someone else shows up at the border instead of his representative, we'll know. The channel was never as private as he believed. She was right about everything, except the timeline. It was not 2 weeks. It was 9 days. On the 9th day, Kessa came to the administrative center before dawn, southern perimeter. 3 wolves. Not Ironvale livery. Different crest entirely. Myra was already standing. How close? They stopped at the outer marker. Not advancing. Not leaving. They've been there. 4 hours. The night watch held position. 4 hours. They had wanted to be seen at dawn. She went to the southern perimeter. One of the 3 wolves was carrying a document case. Let them in. One. The one with the case. The other 2 wait outside. His name was Tomas. He was a council advocate from a southern territory. She had been watching, with the careful attention she gave any territory that traded in legal language. He laid the document case on the hall table, opened it, presented a territorial recognition agreement. She read it in 2 minutes. It was thorough. It was generous. It offered the settlement formal recognition, trading access, protection from any claims by other southern territories. It was also entirely on Asshel contingent, a specific condition outlined on the 3rd page. The settlement's formal affiliation with the Southern Alliance Network. This makes us an affiliate, an autonomous affiliate. I read the language. Autonomous affiliate means no direct governance claim, but full diplomatic obligation. If the alliance comes to war with another southern kingdom, our neutrality is compromised. Who told your council about this settlement? I'm not at liberty. Who told them I was alive? The room went very quiet. Thomas's composure held. But something shifted underneath it. I was told to say the source prefers to remain private. There it was. She nodded once. She closed the document case herself. The answer is no. Thomas departed. She looked at Draal. She's been watching us longer than we knew. Long enough to have a southern territory ready to move before Varek finished writing his letter. She let him send it. She may have encouraged it. Because a private outreach from the king to a potentially hostile northern territory is exactly the kind of action that looks like treason if someone chooses to frame it that way. He's in trouble. That's his problem. Except what she's building around him is also pointed at us. She's not trying to absorb the settlement. She's trying to compromise it before it becomes a legitimate alternative power base. She doesn't want what we've built. She wants to make sure no one else has it either. She turned to the window. 900 people. The morning fully established now. The sound of the learning hall carrying the voices of 91 children. I need a register of every settlement member with unresolved legal status. How many? Roughly 60. Maybe 70. She'll file the claims within days. We have one option. We formalize first. But not through any single territory. She stopped at the door. We call the summit. The silence in the room had a specific texture. The summit of alphas. Convened by tradition only in circumstances of genuine territorial dispute, or the establishment of new sovereignty. The last one had been called 11 years ago. Calling it now, under their circumstances, was not a requestas. It was a declaration. She watched Draal run the calculation she had already run. If we call the summit, we cannot stand in it as an informal settlement looking for recognition. We stand as an equal sovereign power. Or we hand them the narrative. Yes, that means title. For both of us. She held his gaze. She had spent 2 years building a community that functioned without claiming sovereignty over it, deliberately holding the structure loose. So it was genuinely collective, rather than another iteration of the same Alpha owns everything model that had driven most of their people out of the South. Taking formal title changed the nature of what she was. She thought about the Luna, who had organized grain records in a palace that did not want her. She thought about the woman who had crawled out of rubble in the dark with cracked ribs and no help coming. She thought about 900 people below this window. She thought about Ceylon, somewhere south of the line, timing the filing of claims that would pull 60 of those 900 back into a legal machinery designed to unmake them. The Luna would have waited to be given the title. She was done being the Luna, queen. If I stand in that summit hall, I stand as queen of Nightreach, not petitioner, not affiliate, not the woman who used to run grain routes for a king who left her to burn. And if you stand beside me, you stand as what you've always been. Draal looked at her for a long time. Dark Alpha. I've held that title for 8 years. Then it's time it was recognized by the people who've been pretending you don't exist. Both of us. In that hall. Let them see what they chose to ignore. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, not close enough to be crowding. Close enough to be unambiguous. You understand what you're asking. I understand everything I'm asking. He held her gaze. Then, we call the summit. The summit convened on the first cold morning of the northern season. Frost across the stone courtyard of the conclave hall. Every breath came out white. 16 territorial lords, 8 allied alphas, 4 neutral observers from the outer territories who had traveled weeks to be present. The conclave hall had been built 3 generations ago, for moments exactly like this, neutral ground, maintained by all major territories. Belonging to none, the hall was full when the doors opened at the southern end. It went quiet the way spaces go quiet when something enters that rewrites the room's prior understanding of itself. Myra walked in first. The black armor had been crafted in the settlement, fitted to her frame. Treated iron, with shadow gray inlays at the shoulder and collar. No ornamentation except the single crown motif engraved above the breastplate. The crown of Nightreach sat on her head. It was real, not ceremonial gilt. worked iron and black stone, made to be worn by someone who intended to work in it rather than display it. She walked the length of the hall at a pace that said she had never been in a hurry in her life and never intended to start. Drawl walked half a step behind her left shoulder. He wore no crown. He needed none. Every alpha in that hall knew who he was, and every one of them had at some point made a political decision based on the assumption that he would never appear in a southern venue. That assumption was correcting itself. She reached the head of the table. She did not sit, she stood at the head and looked down its length. 16 lords, 8 allied alphas, 4 neutral observers, and she let the silence for exactly as long it needed table. Varric, as she looked at the far end of this there. She had known he would be, she had prepared for it. She had prepared. It did not fully cover the reality of looking at him for the first time in nearly 3 years across a room full of witnesses. He had aged in a way that had nothing to do with years. His was the same face, the strong jaw, the dark eyes. The particular set of his shoulders she had spent years reading like a language, but something had worn through in him, the way stone wears through underwater, not breaking. Becoming thinner in specific places, the easy authority was still there in the surface. Underneath it was something she had not seen in him before. He was looking at her the way a man looks at the direct consequence of the worst decision he ever made, when that consequence has grown beyond anything his imagination offered him at the moment of choosing. There was no calculation in it. There was no political reading of the room. There was just the raw, undisguised impact of a man who thought he understood the shape of his own damage, and had just discovered he was working from an incomplete drawing. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she looked away. She pulled her chair back, sat, placed both hands flat on the table. Nightreach calls this summit to formally establish sovereign recognition. We present documentation of territorial boundaries, population census, infrastructure capacity, 3 years of economic self-sufficiency. We request standard sovereign status under the existing compact. We also have business with this council regarding a pattern of interference that has been directed against our territory by at least one party currently seated at this table. That last sentence moved through the room like a physical thing. Heads turned. Eyes moved to different configurations of suspicion. She watched without letting her attention settle long enough to signal who she meant. The recognition review took 4 hours. She answered every question directly and without elaboration. Drawl answered the security and boundary questions with the same economy. Varric said nothing for the first 3 hours. In the 4th hour, when the recognition review was approaching its close, Varric spoke. I want to speak to the interference claim before the vote. The room went to a different kind of quiet. That item is second on the agenda. The vote won't mean anything if the interference claim is what I think it is. Because if it is, the council needs to know the source before they cast anything. She looked at him then. He was leaning forward, both forearms on the table, his eyes on her with the specific quality of a man who had made a decision and was past the point where second-guessing it served any purpose, not spirit, not performing, just direct. In the way he had occasionally been when direct in the private hours, when he was not managing anyone's perception of him. She had loved that quality in him once. She had also spent 5 years watching it lose to the version of him that needed things to be manageable. Then speak, he straightened. The unofficial communication I sent to Nightreach 12 days ago was intercepted. I sent it through a private channel. Someone in my court accessed that channel and used the information to approach a southern territory before my envoy had received a response. The purpose was to compromise a potential alliance before it could form. I have the messenger's account. I have the timeline. I have a letter in your own legal advocate's handwriting confirming the initial approach came from Ironvale Court. with information that could only have been sourced from my private correspondence. He paused, and I know who, in my court, has been operating independently of my authority for the past 3 years. The hall was completely still. She watched his face. She watched the exact quality of what it cost him to say what he was saying. In front of 16 lords and 8 alphas and 4 observers, which was the complete public dismantling of his court's appearance of internal coherence and his own appearance of control. He was doing it anyway, Celine. She has been conducting independent diplomatic operations using Ironvale's resources and my authority without my knowledge. There are others. The doors at the southern end opened, the specific sound of the hinges. Heavy iron designed to hold against significant force. The guards who should have been managing the hall's access were not managing it. Celine walked into the conclave hall, 6 wolves in Ironvale livery flanking her, a document case under her arm. The composed forward momentum of someone who had been working toward a specific moment for a long time. She walked to the midpoint of the hall, stopped, placed the document case on the table. The council should hear all parties before voting. Her voice was the same voice Myra remembered, smooth, calibrated, built for rooms exactly like this one. Varric said her name, low, warning. Celine opened the document case without looking at him. I have here territorial reclamation filings for 47 individuals currently residing in the northern settlement. Filed with 4 southern territories this morning through independent legal channels. She looked at Myra for the first time. The look was the look of someone who has been holding a weapon for a long time and has finally decided to use it in the open. The filings are legally valid under existing pack law. They predate this summit and are not subject to any recognition vote that occurs here today. 47. Myra kept her hands flat on the table, kept her face absolutely level if the filings held. Those 47 wolves had a legal obligation to return to their home territories for adjudication. She took one breath. She stood. I move for an immediate sovereignty recognition vote. Before this council processes any filing or any further statement, the filings are dated this morning. A sovereignty recognition, if passed, is retroactive to the date of establishment, which our documentation places 3 years ago. Any filing against residents of a recognized sovereign territory is invalid. Call the vote. The chair looked around the table. He looked at the documentation in front of him, with the eyes of a man who had been running territorial law for 30 years. We vote. Celine's hand went to the document case. Her composure shifted. Not breaking, reaching its limit. This council does not have the authority. This council convened this summit. This council has exactly this authority. She moved her hand inside the case, and Myra had been watching for it, because 47 filings were not the endgame. They were the warning shot. Celine had come into this hall, knowing the filings might fail, and she had brought a second weapon. Hold, Drawl was already moving. Varric was already moving. 2 men at opposite ends of a long table. Same destination, same speed, same reason. Celine's hand came out of the case, not a document, a blade, short, designed to be carried invisibly, used close. She raised it, and what happened next happened in less than 2 seconds. The blade arcing toward her throat. Drawl crossing the space with the absolute physical commitment of a man who had made a decision and was purely executing it. Varric closing from the opposite direction. The hall in chaos. The blade was meant for her throat. It was going to miss, because she had moved, and because Varric was between her and it 3 steps ahead of Drawl. He put himself in the blade's arc with the specific totality of a man who was not calculating odds, just acting from the deepest available layer of himself. The layer below strategy and politics and the long history of every wrong choice he had ever made, and the blade caught him across the upper chest and left side, rather than the throat it had been aimed for. And the sound he made was not a sound she had ever heard from him before. He went down to one knee. She caught him. She did not decide to catch him. Her hands moved before she made the choice. And he was heavy against her, and his blood was immediately warm and real through the fabric of her sleeve, and she went down with him to the floor of the conclave hall. Varric looked up at her, blood at his mouth from the impact of the fall. His eyes were clear, shockingly clear. The clarity of a man who had crossed to a place where the weight of everything he had been carrying simply no longer applied. Because there was only this moment, and this specific face above him, still breathing. Don't talk. His hand found her wrist, not desperate. The same gesture she remembered from 1,000 small moments she had spent 2 years working to unremember. I need to say it. Not to fix it. I know it doesn't fix it. I need to say it because it's been 2 years and 9 months. And I have been saying it to an empty room. And I am done saying it to an empty room. She kept her hand on the wound. Pressure. Practical. Varric. I left you in that fire. I saw your hand. I made the choice. I walked away. I have not had a single clean hour since. Everything you built. You built out of what I threw away. You're going to be all right. The wound was deep but not fatal. I know. I didn't put myself in front of that blade to ask for anything. I want you to know that. I know. She looked up. Scene was gone. The northern door at the back of the hall. Kessa was already at the door, 3 of the settlement wolves behind her. But the settlement wolves did not know that building, and Celine did. Myra looked at Varric. The physician was coming. The hall was settling. He was being lifted with care. He nodded at her once go. She went. She caught Celine in the northern passage. She came around the L bend of the passage and saw the gray rectangle of outside light ahead. Where the passage door had been left open in the hurry of someone who had stopped caring about covering their trail. She came through it at a run, cold air, thin morning light. The slope beyond the conclave grounds. Celine was 40 yards ahead, moving through sparse trees at the top of the ridge, and she heard Myra come through the door, and she turned. They looked at each other across 40 yards of frost-pale ground. Celine did not run. That was the thing that told Myra everything she still needed to know. A person running was a person operating on fear. A person who turned and stood was a person who had made a decision. Myra walked toward her. When she was 10 yards out, she stopped, left hand. Celine brought her left hand out. It was holding the blade. You won the vote. And you tried to murder me in front of 24 witnesses. So I'd say only one of us is having a good morning. You filed 47 reclamation claims against people who left their home territories to build something better. People who had nothing to do with whatever is between you and me. That's not strategy. That's cruelty with paperwork attached. You want to talk about cruelty? I want to ask you one question. That night, the fire, was it yours? Celine was very still. I'm not in the habit of confessing to women holding swords. Then don't confess. Tell me one true thing. You owe me that much. A long moment. The Eastern Gate. Yes, there it was, 2 years and 9 months. Spoken out loud, by the only mouth that could speak it. Why? Because you asked one question too many about the royal treasury. Because you were quiet, and quiet people see things. And because no one was ever going to choose you. So I made sure there was nothing left to choose. Myra heard it. She let it land. And then she said the thing that surprised even her. You're not wrong about the choosing. I did spend 5 years waiting on a version of him that did not exist. I knew it, I just did not let myself know it. So in a strange way, you and I both built our lives around the same illusion. Yours had paperwork, mine had tea. But that does not make what you did right. It makes it easier. Those are not the same thing. Put down the blade, a long moment. Celine put the blade down. She set it on the ground at her feet. What happens now? You go back into that hall. You answer to the council for the assassination attempt, and the reclamation filings, and the gate, and the treasury, and the night the throne hall burned. I will not advocate for severity. I will not advocate for leniency. I will answer questions honestly, and then I will let the process do what the process is for. Because I spent 2 years building something I'm proud of, and the person I had to become to build it does not have space for the satisfaction of watching someone else suffer. She reached down and picked up Selen's blade from the ground. She held it by the flat. She offered it back. Not the handle, the flat. Selen took it. They walked back through the passage to the conclave hall together. Not speaking, the proceedings took the rest of the day. Selene was held by the council's authority pending formal review. The reclamation filings were voided formally in the official record. She watched it happen, and she felt the particular quiet of a thing completed, not triumphant, not hollow, just the factual sensation of a process reaching its conclusion after a very long arc. Varric was attended by the council's physician throughout. When the formal proceedings concluded, he caught her eye from across the room. She made a decision. She walked to him. She pulled a chair to a reasonable distance and sat. He looked at her for a moment. The settlement. What you built. I read the documentation during the review. I recognized the framework. You used the model from the Ironvale grain allocation brief you wrote in your second year. The original had several structural inefficiencies. Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, yeah. I never actually read the original brief. One of the stewards summarized it for me. He absorbed that in the flat way of information that arrived 3 years too late to change anything. Varric. You left me in the fire. You saw me reaching for you. You calculated. You made a choice. And then you spent 2 years telling yourself it was the only choice available. It was not the only choice. There was another choice. And you knew what it was, and it was harder. And you did not make it. He did not look away. Yes, I survived it. And I built something that took what you threw away and made it into something larger than either of us. I'm telling you this because you spent 2 years saying it to the walls, and you are owed the experience of saying it to the actual person. And I am owed the experience of hearing it acknowledged rather than managed. It was the worst thing I've ever done, worse than any military failure, because those had external causes. This one was just me, choosing wrong on purpose, in full knowledge. I have thought about your hand reaching through that door every single day. I'm not asking you to make it stop. I'm just telling you that whatever I am now is partly built from knowing I was capable of that. And living inside it, she looked at him for a long time. This was what honest pain looked like, when it had been carried for nearly 3 years. Without being put down, I don't forgive you because you deserve it. I forgive you because carrying the weight of what you did is costing me storage I need for other things. Because the settlement needs the administrative capacity I have been putting into the infrastructure of being unforgiving. And I have decided that's a bad allocation of resources. That's the most you thing I've ever heard. Yes, something shifted in the air between them. Not warming exactly, not the old thing reconstituted, but something honest. Contemporary, built from what they both actually were now, rather than what they had been. She stood. Take care of the wound. Have the physician look at it again before you travel. Myra, she waited. I'm glad you didn't die in that fire. It was so simple it was almost stark. I'm glad I didn't, either. She walked back to the head of the table. Drawl was there. He looked at her when she reached him. He read her face. Done. Done. The horses were ready at the courtyard's eastern end. She mounted without assistance. She looked back once at the conclave hall's stone face in the mid-morning light. Then she looked forward. Drawl was beside her. She looked at him. When this is done, when we're home and the alliance terms are drafted and the spring planting is underway. Yes, I haven't finished the sentence. I know what the sentence is. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something in her chest that had been held in careful suspension for 2 years and 9 months settled into a new position, not dramatic. Not a flood, just the quiet internal shift of something finding where it belongs. Yes, they rode. The old track ran north through the thinning forest. The frost was coming off the ground in small rising wisps. The territorial lands of the south fell behind them mile by mile. She did not look back. She had looked back enough. She had looked at the intersection, and the smoke, and the door gap, and the calculation in his eyes, and she had taken from it everything it had to teach, which was this: that she was the kind of person who reached through fire, and that the only thing worth doing with that knowledge was finding a life that deserved it. She had found it. It was 900 people in a valley that the maps called empty. It was a man riding beside her who had pulled her out of the rubble, not because he needed something from her, but because she was alive, and that was reason enough. She was not the Luna of Ironvale. She was not the woman who had burned. She was not the woman who had burning, and she was still here. And she was going home. Nightreach rose ahead of her in the late morning light, the ridge, the valley, the smoke of 900 cook fires rising in thin straight lines against the cold blue sky, and she rode toward it without slowing, without hesitation, with the absolute forward momentum of a woman who had earned every mile of the road beneath her. She had risen from ashes. She had built an empire. She had learned, at last and at cost, the difference between being chosen and being seen. She chose herself. That had been, from the beginning, the only choice that mattered.